You lock your front door every night. Maybe you check it twice. Now imagine losing the single most important object your entire civilization owns, and not just misplacing it, but having no idea when it disappeared, who took it, or where it ended up. That's not a hypothetical. That's the actual, unresolved history of the Ark of the Covenant. One day it's mentioned in the historical record. Then, without warning, it isn't. And nobody agrees on what happened in between. You've probably seen the Ark in a movie before you ever read about it in a book. Golden box, winged angels on top, melts Nazi faces if you open it. That image is fun, but it's fiction layered on top of something real. The actual Ark, according to the Hebrew Bible, was a wooden chest covered in gold, built to house the stone tablets of the Ten Commandments. It sat in the innermost chamber of the temple in Jerusalem, a space so sacred that only the high priest could enter it, and only once a year. This wasn't just a religious object. It was described as the literal seat of God's presence on earth. Losing it wasn't just a tragedy. It was, in the worldview of the people who built it, almost unthinkable.
And yet, it's missing. Here's where the mystery actually starts. The last time the Ark is clearly mentioned in the biblical text is during the reign of King Solomon, when it's placed inside the first temple around the 10th century BCE. After that, the references get vague, inconsistent, and eventually stop altogether. By the time the Babylonians destroy the temple in 586 BCE, the Ark isn't mentioned as being captured, burned, or carried off. It's just gone, absent from the story, before the story even gets to that part. Think about that for a second. When the Babylonians looted the temple, ancient chroniclers were careful to list what was taken: gold vessels, silver basins, ceremonial items, all cataloged. But the single most sacred object in the entire building isn't on the list. Was it already gone by then? And if so, when did it leave? And who moved it?
To understand how strange that gap really is, you have to understand what the Ark was supposed to do inside the temple. According to the biblical account, its presence marked the one location on earth where God's glory rested directly among the people. Priests who approached it improperly weren't described as facing minor consequences. They were described as facing death. This wasn't a ceremonial box tucked in a side room. It was, in the belief system of the entire kingdom, the most dangerous and most sacred object that existed. An institution that careful about protecting something doesn't lose track of it by accident. There are three major theories, and each one comes with real historical footwork behind it, not just speculation.
The first theory says the Ark was destroyed or looted along with everything else in 586 BCE, and simply wasn't considered important enough to record separately, or the record of it was lost along with countless other documents from that period. This is the least dramatic answer, and probably the most boring for a documentary. But historians like Bar-Ilan University archaeologist Yosef Garfinkel have pointed out that ancient record-keeping was inconsistent, even for objects we know mattered enormously. Absence from a list isn't the same as proof of survival elsewhere. Sometimes things vanish from history simply because nobody wrote down the ending. There's a reasonable version of this theory that doesn't even require anything dramatic to have happened. Wood doesn't survive fire well, and even gold-plated wood, once stripped of its outer covering by looters more interested in metal than symbolism, would have left very little behind worth cataloging. If that's what happened, the Ark's disappearance isn't a mystery at all. It's just what destruction usually looks like, stripped of the myth that tends to get added to important things after the fact. The problem is that this explanation, however plausible, doesn't fully satisfy the two competing traditions that insist the Ark was moved to safety before the destruction ever happened.
The second theory is more interesting, and it comes with actual archaeological attention behind it. Ethiopia. According to Ethiopian tradition, recorded in a 14th century text called the Kebra Nagast, the Ark was taken out of Jerusalem generations earlier, during the reign of King Solomon himself, by his son Menachem, believed to be born from Solomon's relationship with the Queen of Sheba. The tradition holds that the Ark has been kept ever since in a small chapel in the town of Aksum in northern Ethiopia, guarded by a single monk who never leaves the grounds and who is the only person allowed to see it. That monk holds the role for life, and when he dies, a successor is chosen and takes his place.
Is this provable? Not directly, because Ethiopian authorities don't allow the Ark, or whatever object is in that chapel, to be examined by outside researchers. British scholar Tudor Parfitt, who spent years researching Jewish ancestral claims in Africa, has written extensively about the plausibility of ancient Israelite contact with parts of East Africa long before the medieval period, based on separate evidence involving the Lemba people further south. That doesn't prove the Aksum Ark is real, but it does mean the idea of ancient objects and traditions moving along trade routes into Africa isn't pure fantasy. It's a documented pattern, even if this specific claim remains unverified.
Here's what makes the Ethiopia theory strange, rather than simply unlikely. The tradition has been maintained continuously, without interruption, for centuries, by a religious institution that has never once allowed the claim to be tested. That's either the sign of an elaborate, deeply committed fabrication, or the sign of something people have quietly protected for longer than most nations have existed. Archaeologist Sean Kingsley, who has written specifically on the disappearance of the Ark, has noted that the Ethiopian claim is taken seriously enough by scholars that it can't simply be dismissed as folklore, even though it also can't be confirmed. The third theory keeps the Ark much closer to home, underneath the Temple Mount itself in Jerusalem.
Jewish tradition holds that before the Babylonian destruction, the Ark was hidden in a chamber beneath the temple complex, specifically to protect it from exactly the kind of looting that was coming. The Mishnah, an early rabbinic text, references a spot in the temple where the Ark was believed to be concealed. If true, that would mean the Ark never left Jerusalem at all. It's still there, sealed beneath one of the most politically sensitive religious sites on the planet.
This theory is compelling because it doesn't require anyone to move a sacred object hundreds of miles across hostile territory during a military invasion, which historically tends to go poorly. It only requires people to hide it well and never tell anyone exactly where. The problem is that the Temple Mount today sits under the Dome of the Rock, an Islamic holy site, and any excavation there is not just an archaeological question, but a geopolitical one. Full-scale digging is essentially impossible, which means this theory may never be tested. Not because the evidence doesn't exist, but because nobody can safely go looking for it.
Biblical scholar Menachem Haran, who spent decades studying the temple's construction and priestly rituals, argued that the layout described in ancient texts does include structural features consistent with hidden storage chambers beneath the sanctuary floor. That doesn't confirm anything was actually placed there. It just means the physical possibility isn't far-fetched, which is more than can be said for a lot of ancient legends. The frustrating part isn't a lack of a plausible location. It's that the one place most likely to hold the answer is also the one place on the entire planet where nobody is currently allowed to dig. So which theory is right? Honestly, historians don't know. And the ones who study this seriously will tell you that directly instead of pretending otherwise.
But there's something worth sitting with in all three explanations. Every single theory, whether it's Ethiopia, the Temple Mount, or simple loss in the chaos of conquest, requires someone at some point to have made a deliberate choice to hide something rather than let it be destroyed or stolen. Even the most mundane version of this story, the one where the ark simply burned with the rest of the temple, still requires us to accept that the people who wrote down history afterward chose not to record its ending. That's not nothing. That's a decision, even if we don't know who made it.
There's a pattern here you've probably seen before in ordinary life, just at a much smaller scale. Think about a family heirloom that gets mentioned in old letters and then quietly stops appearing in later ones. Nobody announces it's gone. It just isn't brought up anymore. Sometimes that means it was lost. Sometimes it means somebody deliberately stopped talking about it, because talking about where it really went would have been dangerous, or personal, or simply nobody's business anymore. The ark's disappearance has that same shape, just stretched across nearly 3,000 years, and an entire civilization's worth of record-keeping, instead of one family's letters.
What's genuinely remarkable is how much modern behavior mirrors the ancient behavior here. Ethiopian guardianship of a sacred object nobody is allowed to inspect isn't so different from any institution today that protects something valuable by strictly controlling access to it, rather than by publicly proving its authenticity. Sometimes protecting a thing's meaning matters more to the people guarding it than proving it exists to everyone else. That's not evidence the ark is really in that chapel in Aksum, but it does explain why the tradition has survived intact for so long, when so much else from the ancient world hasn't.
And the Temple Mount theory says something else entirely about human behavior under pressure. When people know destruction is coming and they can't fight it, they don't always try to save everything. Sometimes they choose one thing to protect, hide it as completely as they can, and accept that everything else might be lost. That's not defeat. That's triage. And if the ark really is sitting in a sealed chamber somewhere beneath modern Jerusalem, it means someone, over 2,500 years ago, made exactly that calculation. And it worked well enough that we're still debating it today, instead of already knowing the answer.
So the next time somebody tells you the Ark of the Covenant is just a movie prop with a good backstory, you can tell them the real version is stranger, because nobody has ever definitively closed the case, not because the evidence was destroyed, but because in each of the leading theories, Someone chose to make sure it never could be found, and whoever they were, they succeeded so completely that we're still asking the same question they were trying to prevent anyone from ever answering. You lock your door every night, assuming what's inside will still be there in the morning. Whoever hid the ark, wherever they hid it, made sure that question would outlive every single person who ever knew the answer.